All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of From the Mount, our podcast with everything from Mount Paran Christian School. Thank you for joining us for another episode. My name is Steve Kyle, and I am the host of this episode of From the Mount. And again, I think I'll say this over every episode because every episode they've been awesome and exciting. So I'm always excited about this episode. There's some great stuff. And for me, I learned a lot in doing some preparation, and I hope you will as well. But joining me again on this podcast is our Director of Counseling, Viola,
here.
and really turning into a fantastic co-host of this podcast,
I do what I can.
But I'm also thrilled to have our middle school counselor, Jocelyn Sotomayor. She is joining us as well today because we're going to be talking about something that I literally know nothing about. But she has done much teaching with and writing about. But Jocelyn, welcome to our podcast. And before we dig into today's episode, kind of give our listeners a little bit about who you are so they know who they're listening to.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. You're two of my favorite people, so I'm excited. I have been here at Mount Paran for 4 years. So this is my 4th year, but I've been in education for about 25. If you see me, you wouldn't believe it because, so
You
young.
look so young.
I look so young. No, but it's
started at like
very
3,
young,
right?
very, very young. I'm a genius. But yes, about 25 years in different capacities. But right now, I'm super proud to be the middle school counselor. So I work with grades 6th, 7th, and 8th.
Yeah. And of course, you're a mom of your own.
Yes.
So you do even some parental counseling.
Oh, absolutely.
With your own and great things are going on in middle school and great where you're involved for sure. And if you know anything about middle schoolers, being a middle school counselor, I mean, you're earning it over there.
Jesus took the wheel.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fun. I can tell
fun.
you that it's definitely fun.
It is fun, but there's never a day, I think, in which you're just kind of staring blankly at the wall as a middle school counselor.
Unless it's in shock.
Yeah,
Just
maybe.
kidding.
Which happens.
Yes.
All right. Well, let me. Today's episode is about executive functioning, which I know if you're listening right now, you're running on the treadmill. You're like, yes, this is exactly what I dialed in for. No, I'll be honest with you. And I've been in Christian education for a long time, and although I've heard this phrase before, it's kind of edu-speak, and we hear it, but it's actually really, really, really crucial. And you recently did a couple of parent eds on this. You wrote a blog on this. I read the blog on this, said, would love to do a podcast about this. And so real quick, let's start with defining what in the world is executive functioning.
It's not difficult to understand. Executive functions are a set of skills that they live, like I like to say, they live in the frontal part of your brain. So basically your forehead, that's the area of the brain that hosts the executive functions. And those skills work together to tell the brain to filter information that we receive through our senses and tell the rest of the brain how to operate. It is the part of the brain that controls judgment and emotional regulation and flexibility and control inhibition. And just I follow the methodology of two very well-known scientists in the world of ADHD, Dr. Guerra and Dawson, and they wrote the book Smart But Scatter. It's a series of books. They've done plenty of research, and they have defined 11 executive functions. Other scientists will define them as 3 or 8, but I like their approach because they're easy to understand. And those 11 executive functions, like I said, they filter the information that we get from our eyes and what we smell, what we hear, and it tells the rest of your brain what to do next.
Yeah, it's interesting. In your blog, you call them the gatekeeper skills. And so basically everything is being processed through this, and then your body responds accordingly, essentially.
Absolutely.
The way it does. And it's interesting. You don't think about that stuff. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the reality is it's processing, I would imagine, maybe more millions of bits of data in so many different ways. And you don't think about that until you have to think about that, or until maybe you realize something's not right.
Absolutely. Executive functions is kind of a trend word, and we started hearing about it more I want to say about 10 years ago, and there's been a lot of research on in the last 10 years in terms of defining it and understanding the role in our brain. And it actually takes about 40% of our mental capacity. Our executive functions are about 40% of our mental capacity. So that's a lot. That's much more than other parts of your brain.
Well, and if it's housed in the front part of our brain, isn't that the part of the brain that develops like last?
Yes, that is absolutely right. So in terms of brain development, I'm fascinated by brain development, and I'm not an expert by any means, but it's important to understand that the brain develops from the bottom to the top. So we are born with our brain stem, and actually a fun fact, the brain is the only organ that is not fully developed by birth. Mm-hmm. So our brain is slightly developed by the time we're born, and we do have our brain stem because that's the part of our brain that hosts our survival skills. That is the part of the brain that controls our breathing and our heartbeat and digestion. We need those for survival, so we have to have it when we're born. Executive functions are not formed at all because, like we mentioned, that's the frontal part of the brain. So the brain develops from the bottom to the top, and what science has been able to prove in the last decades is that puberty, we used to believe that puberty was over by 18 years of age. You know, when you look like a man or when you look like a woman,
Sure.
That's when people thought, oh, they're done with puberty.
Yeah.
Well, we have learned that brain and puberty actually is completed by your mid-20s. So think about that.
Yeah.
Right.
Think about that. We get married at 23 and our
Yeah.
brain is not
Yes.
fully
I think
developed yet.
Child
puberty-
bride.
Yeah, puberty's done when God says it's done.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? We can't give it. And to me, that's all I think is you explain all of that developmentally. And again, maybe it's just because of what I do in my role here. I'm just blown away. I'm marveled at creation when you think of the way, because I wouldn't even,
I was literally thinking the same thing.
but the way you even explain it, how the brain, God creates the brain to develop as we need what we need when we need it, and then boom, you come out. You don't I'm guessing while you're in the womb, you don't need to process a ton of
need to
data
think
while you're
a
in
lot.
there. You're not trying to focus on anything. You're not studying. I don't believe.
You're
at
just
least I don't
growing.
remember. You're just growing. Yeah, but it is. To me, it's just such an awesome miracle when you consider that.
So you develop about 80% of your brain by the time you're 5 years of age, and that is true. You heard that before. It is true. About 80% of your brain is developed by age 5. And then the rest of the time, the brain is going to continue growing. And when you reach adolescence, there's a second big brain growth. And there's a process called pruning that happens during the teenage years, which means that all those neurons, all those brain cells that were not assigned to a specific task based on experience and exposure, then they're shed. The brain doesn't need them, because if the brain keeps it, our heads would be way too big. So the brain actually, mega mind, yeah. We have to shed those neurons. And then that's when the brain actually starts completing that process of development. So it's perfect. The way the brain develops is God's perfection.
Yeah, it is. And for people to say anything other, I'm blown away by that. And so that's awesome. So when we talk about this, so we've already mentioned there are, based on and again, there's discussion of how many of these there actually are, but you list 11, and through your parent ed, you talked about 11. You list them in your blog. And by the way, you can find this blog located on our Mount Paran website. So if you're looking for it, you can go to our Mount Paran website, whether you're a parent or not, and you can find where our blog is posted on there. And if there's a way we can attach it to this podcast, we'll attach a link to that as well. But you list 11 of them, and we're going to focus on maybe not all 11 of them just for the sake of time. I'm going to quickly run down the list because I'm going to have you unpack the key ones here. But we have response inhibition. So if maybe you're at home and you're taking notes, because everybody takes notes when they listen to podcasts. Never. Working memory, emotional control, sustained attention, task initiation, flexibility, planning and prioritizing, organization, time management, goal-directed persistence, and metacognition. That's a lot. If you're listening, if you're listening to this early, that's a lot before breakfast, isn't it, Viola?
Right.
That's a lot of big words.
That is a lot.
So, but there are 4 Was it 4, I think?
Yes.
That you think there are probably 4 that are really, really crucial. I want you to talk about what those 4 are and really quickly kind of unpack them enough that anybody who, like the average listener, me, I'm the average, would go, I know what that is. I know what she's talking about.
So interestingly, when people think about executive functions, is there one that you think about the most? I ask, like when you think about a student that has problem with executive functions, what do you think about?
The first one
disorganized.
I think about impulse control.
Impulse
Oh,
control?
really?
And
Yeah,
you?
I do. Here's why, because I think it was an issue as I read this that I had, and frankly,
Yeah.
still have a mild case of.
It resonated.
Yeah, it did. So it really does. That's
yeah,
the one
okay.
I think about, and I think it's because it resonated. And I think if any issue I struggled with in school, and I was an above average but a below perform, like I was an underachiever. You know, my mom would tell me that all the time. Son, you're an
agree with
underachiever. Thanks, Mom. No, I was, but impulse control is what I think of.
What about you?
Messy book bag and losing things.
Organization.
Disorganization.
So
Yeah.
it's interesting because impulse control, yes, is one of the most important ones, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but organization is actually not. So I like to talk first about response inhibition, and to me that is the most important executive function that a human can have and needs to have. And that is that ability to control yourself, to control your responses and your reactions no matter what's happening around you. And children struggle with that, but adults also struggle with that, right?
I mean, yes.
And it's important. And how do we see it? So for example, we're in the classroom and the teacher says, wait your turn to answer the question, and you have the kid that will blurt out questions. That is a very simple example of response inhibition. It's also about other things, but most importantly, they just can't control that impulse to respond or to do something. And we see it in so many areas. We see it at home when we give our kids instructions on doing something and they just completely do something else. But it's important. Response inhibition is important because you need to be in control of yourself to be able to perform. If you can't control yourself, nobody can control you. Right. And we are always imposing control over kids, and that's important in some aspects. But that self-control is so much more important. That awareness that I have to control myself no matter the stimulus around me.
Well, and if you're listening to this and you're thinking, okay, executive functioning, this is really cool, super interesting, I really like this topic. And then, you know, one thing that we have been, as a school, been talking more about is just that biblical worldview. This is a concept that happens over and over again in the Bible. You know, so this is not, it's not mutually exclusive where it's biblically speaking, you live one way and then your executive functioning is another. So this is something that it's called maybe something different, or the times that it is referenced on how we should act and how we should behave and what we should do. Those are all things that we're seeing in this educational organizational setting.
How many times you've been doing your devotion in the morning and maybe use your phone to do the devotion, and all of a sudden you get a text and you're like, I know I should not read that text right now because I'm doing my devotion, but it's just very quickly. That is actually response inhibition.
Right?
That's absolutely.
All right, what's the second one? If
Working memory. And working memory, some people call it short-term memory, and yes, they're almost the same thing, but it's that ability to hold information in your brain in order to perform another task. The way I explain it to the kids is that when you're making you're baking something, you have to follow directions and you have to kind of remember what ingredients you already put in, so you put in the other ingredients.
Right.
And how many times do you have to read that recipe and think, did I just put this in? That being able to hold that information in your head in order to perform another task, that's working memory. And we see it a lot in school, for example, in math. You have to be able to hold your math facts in order to answer an equation.
Yeah.
And a lot of kids will struggle with working memory.
Yeah. Now, is that the same as me walking into my kitchen and then going, no, why did I come in here? Have you ever done that? Have you ever walked into a room because you went in to do something and then you're like,
everyday.
I'm not sure why I'm here, but I think I'll have a snack.
Yeah.
Well, that's that's interestingly, that's actually
Yeah.
sustained attention.
Okay. Well, then
So,
I need to work
so
on that.
we'll go to sustained attention. But the third that I proposed as one of the most important is emotional control. You have to be able to navigate your feelings in a healthy way. And it kind of goes along with response inhibition. And our executive functions work together. Never think that they work independently. They depend on each other. But to be able to explain them, we explain them separately, of course. And emotional control is you controlling your reactions as well and your emotions, getting yourself in check in order to perform a task. So we can get angry. We can be angry. But we need to continue driving safely, right? We can be angry at someone that is driving recklessly, but you need to be able to control yourself enough to continue driving safely and get home and get your kids home. So that emotional control, we see it also in school all the time, and kids do struggle with that, with that emotional control, because it's actually a difficult skill to learn.
It is, yeah. And again, we can look at that. God made us highly emotional. I mean, he's given us those abilities and we're not all emotional at the same level. Some people, there's emotional disconnect. Some people are I don't want to say over emotional, because I don't think to say over emotional means that somehow you're different.
Your emotional response is different.
Sure.
We have different emotional responses.
But it's the kind of the responsibility of how do I handle those emotions? You know, God made me this way, and it's okay that I feel a certain way.
Right.
But am I going to do so in a way that glorifies God? Am I going to do so in a way and where that
and
plays
the kids,
in?
for example, when they get feedback from a teacher and they start crying, instead of receiving that feedback as constructive and growing from that, they cry. That is emotional control. So those are examples.
This is a total sidebar, but it's like I'm listening to all this and think of all the times that we've had to discipline based off of the lack of emotional control or the responses, the impulses and things like that, and how all of this, it just made me think.
Well, and how we sometimes respond wrongly to someone else's, like we're and many of us who have maybe better emotional control allow the lack of emotional control, in some cases uncontrollable by the individual, affect our emotions to a place that's unfair.
Correct.
Or I'm guilty of this. I'm guilty of probably as a dad responding this way to my own children in a way when I should be the one that's exhibiting self-discipline, emotional control, but I'm allowing the lack of that in a child, my own children, affect me in that way. And
we take it personal.
What's that?
We take it personal.
We do. And that's Holy Spirit control. I mean, there's so many, I think, variables we could go
One of
into.
the reasons why I'm on this campaign to teach about the brain and executive functions is because when you understand development, then your expectations are more realistic. If you understand that a 13-year-old can handle this much information in this way, then you don't expect anything else and you're not disappointed, or the kid is not disappointed. But I think sometimes we forget that the brain develops this way and our expectations are unrealistic.
Yeah,
and
that's
lastly,
great.
I'm just going to mention quickly the last one is sustained attention, which is a lot of what we see, for example, in class. We talk about kids that lack focus. And sustained attention is that ability to maintain focus over time. You need to be able to maintain focus on a task, and you also need to be able to switch to another task and sustain attention doing that other task. The multitasking thing that people talk about, I can multitask, that's actually it doesn't exist. You can't really perform two complex tasks at the same time, but you can switch attention pretty quickly from one to the other.
So when my wife says she's doing that, I can say, no, you're not. Jocelyn said, that's impossible. You're not multitasking. All right, good. So there's two things I want to kind of end with a little bit because I want our listeners to maybe walk away with kind of an. You mentioned in your blog, and no doubt when you were doing the Paran eds about nature nurture.
Oh yes.
About these two things, and I think most listeners are aware of what nature nurture is compared to what we're given kind of at birth, and then kind of how we're raised. If you could briefly speak to both of those and their role in this, because I want parents to understand the impact. There's the nature part of the way God's made us.
Yes, of course.
But there's also the nurture part, our responsibility even maybe as parents and how we're raising our kids. Can you speak briefly to
Absolutely.
to those?
We cannot deny our genes. You know, we are 50% our moms, 50% our dad, and we are going to inherit a lot of traits from our parents, period. Illnesses, learning disabilities that are actually have a highly genetic component. that is easy to understand, right? We have physical characteristics, etc. And then we have the nurture part, which is how we are raised. What are we exposed to? What experiences do we have? And our brains are social organs, which means that they grow and develop with relationships. There's no other way. The brain will grow, but it will not develop if it doesn't have proper interactions. And that's the nurture part of our development. The brain, we need to expose our kids to what we want them to learn. If we want them to learn to love the Lord, we teach them from the moment they're born how to love and serve the Lord. If we want them to learn to play an instrument, you expose them to an instrument and you expose them to music. If you want them to play some sort of sport, you expose them to playing with a ball or developing their fine motor skills and their gross motor skills. That is the way the brain actually develops. And by the time, like I said before, by the time adolescence comes and puberty, those neurons that were not assigned to a particular task are going to be shed. And those that were assigned to a particular task, like playing with a ball, like, baseball, or understanding and having a strong spiritual life or Christian life, then those areas are going to get stronger. Right. Because now the brain can focus all the energy into those areas that are already developing.
Which is why it's so important. I mean, what does it say in our mission statement? I mean, we want to unite home, church, and school. Yeah. Like that is, so the goal should be that the student is essentially anywhere that they go, they are receiving that information. So as a parent, I should not just be like, okay, well, they're going to get the God stuff at here, and then they're going to get this other stuff at here. Yes. It's, we all have to be on the same page about what we're all doing and what the goal is for our child, so that we can all say the same thing, do the same thing, be the same thing, and that they're constantly hearing it instead of hearing conflicting and differing messages.
The more exposed they are, the more exposed they are. We learn through connections and experiences. The more exposed we are to something, the stronger the connections in the brain, the synapses, the stronger they get. So yes, if we hear the same information here and at home, those connections are going to be stronger and stronger.
So it's so important. The information I mean, that's why it stresses even more as parents. We're to be making sure that we're focusing on the development of our kids early on at this kind of this biblical worldview emphasis that we should be pointing them and training them, and Scripture reminds us. And it also just brings, and we'll finish with this, that it's why, when you were talking about all this development and our brains processing, and it's why a lot of the data I've read, and we're going to do a podcast on this, on technology and its impact, it's why they're even saying, and this isn't even just Mount Paran or Christians say you shouldn't give a cell phone or these type of devices to kids that are really under 14 or 15, because they even lack the emotional and mental ability to be able to process. I mean, we're giving them the world and exposing them to the world without the tools to be able to even process that. Right. And so as a parent, that's what we're doing. And we're exposing them to stuff that they can't yet manage. And I think it's leading to this high anxiety and greater levels of focus issues and so as a parent, I think we just need to...
I just say, biologically, they cannot handle it. Correct. We're not saying that, he's not mature enough. No, really, he's not. The brain is only literally not mature, not developed enough to be able to handle all those pressures or the temptation. They just can't.
Correct.
It's not a matter of wanting.
Yeah.
They can't.
Yeah, so get off the treadmill. Go take your phone from your kid right now.
Slap it out of their hand.
Well, listen, we're going to be no doubt talking more about this subject in the future. And Jocelyn, great to have you on.
Thank you so much for having
this
me.
episode, talking about a really important thing. And so, parents, as you're listening, moms, dads, whoever's out there listening, just keep in mind the important role we play. When you think executive function, it's not something that just takes place here at school. No. Man, we play an important role as parents in this thing. So, Viola, thanks again for being here. And thank you guys for joining us on From the Mount.